Her father pushed the envelope across the table as if he were offering charity to a stranger. His fingers lingered on the polished surface of the table for a moment before he leaned back in his chair with a tight, rehearsed smile. "We think it's best for everyone," he said calmly, though his tone carried a sharp edge. "You've had your fun, but our daughter deserves someone who can keep up." I didn't reach for the envelope. Across from me, my wife Lena blinked in confusion. Her eyes moved from her father's face to the envelope, then to me. "Dad, what is this?" she asked, her voice uneasy. Her mother gave a small sigh, as if this entire moment were merely a practical discussion that needed to be handled. "It's not personal, sweetheart," she said softly. "We just think it's time you outgrew fairy tales." For a moment, the restaurant seemed quieter than before. The clinking of glasses, the distant murmur of conversations around us, the soft music playing somewhere in the background, all of it faded behind the tension at our table. "My name is Ethan Shaw. I've been married to Lena for 3 years. To Lena, I've always been a quiet man who works a modest tech job, drinks cheap coffee, and prefers simple things. I never flaunted money. I never talked about power or success. I let the world assume whatever it wanted about me. What Lena never knew, what her parents never imagined, was that I was the silent co-founder of the very company where her father proudly served as a director. Every major decision made there in the last 5 years had passed across my desk before it reached anyone else. This dinner hadn't been accidental. I had requested it. I had chosen the table, and the envelope sitting between us. I had already guessed what it would contain before it ever touched the table. Finally, I picked it up. The paper felt heavier than it should have. I opened it slowly and glanced inside. A check. $500,000. The memo line was empty, but the message was clear: walk away from Lena. I looked up. Her parents were watching me with quiet confidence, already planning a future where I disappeared like a small inconvenience that had finally been handled. I folded the check, slid it back into the envelope without a word, and pushed it back across the table. Lena stared at me, then at her parents. "What the hell is this?" she demanded. Her father didn't even blink. "Security, sweetheart," he replied calmly. "This man isn't your future. He's just a phase." The words hung in the air like a slap. Lena looked stunned, as though the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. Her parents sat there composed, convinced they were doing the right thing. I stayed quiet. I wanted to see who they really were when no one was trying to impress anyone else. No politeness, no masks, and tonight they showed everything. "Take the check," her mother said, turning to me. "Start over somewhere else. We'll even help you relocate." For a moment, I let out a quiet breath that almost turned into a laugh. "Do you think I married Lena for money?" I asked. Her father leaned forward, his expression hard. "I think people like you," he said slowly, "who don't come from much always find their way to women like my daughter. People like me." The phrase echoed in my mind. I smiled slightly and turned toward Lena. "I didn't want you to hear this like this," I said gently. "I never cared about impressing them. I only ever wanted you to love me for who I am." She frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" I reached into my coat and pulled out a small business card. I placed it on the table and slid it toward her father. The moment he saw the logo, his eyes twitched. It was the logo of the company he proudly introduced at every event. The same company whose board meetings he attended every month. I nodded once. "I've owned 49% of it," I said calmly, "since before you became a director." The room went completely still. The silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut through the air. Lena stared at me as if she didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or demand an explanation. Her father's face slowly drained of color. "You're lying," he muttered. I raised an eyebrow. "Would you like me to recite the Articles of Incorporation?" I asked calmly. "Or remind you who approved your last bonus structure?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. Lena picked up the business card with trembling fingers. 49%, she whispered. Her mother gave a nervous laugh. "That's impossible," she said quickly. What are you? A barista? A nobody? That's what you saw?" I replied gently. "Because that's what I allowed you to see." Then I turned back to Lena. I stayed quiet because I wanted one part of my life that wasn't built on money, influence, or power. I wanted something real, something where people didn't measure love like a business transaction. Her father finally found his voice. "If any of this is true," he said sharply, "then why come here tonight?" I met his gaze calmly. "Because I wanted to see who you were when you believed I was beneath you." He stood abruptly, his fists clenched. "You humiliated us." "No," I said as I slowly rose from my seat. "You did that yourselves." Then I turned to Lena. "Are you ready to go?" We left the restaurant without another word. The night air outside felt cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the storm we had just walked away from. Lena didn't speak during the drive home. The city lights slid across the windshield as we moved through the streets in silence. Finally, halfway home, she turned toward me. "You were going to keep this from me forever?" I glanced at her briefly. "No," I said, "but I wasn't going to tell you while your father tried to buy me off like an employee he could replace." She looked out the window, her thoughts clearly tangled. "I don't even know what to feel right now," she admitted. "Start with the truth," I said quietly. "You married a man who builds things quietly. Someone who doesn't need to show off money to prove his worth." She stayed silent for a long time. Then she said softly, "You let me believe we were struggling." "We weren't," I replied. "But I wanted a real relationship, not a performance." Later that night, Lena's father called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. A few minutes later, an email arrived. Just one sentence. "We need to talk. This affects the board." There it was. He had finally connected the dots. Because I didn't just co-own the company. I held the patent for the software that had pushed the company's value into the billions. Unlike his title, my name was permanently written into the foundation of the company. They had tried to erase me with a check. Now they were beginning to understand something important. Real power doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it stays quiet until the moment it finally decides to speak. The next board meeting was scheduled for Thursday. I didn't RSVP. Instead, I showed up early. Not in an expensive suit. Just the same gray sweater they used to mock whenever I picked Lena up from family gatherings. I wanted them to recognize me, not as a stranger, but as the man they once believed was easy to dismiss. In the moment I stepped into the glass boardroom, silence felt like a sudden drop in pressure. Every conversation stopped. Her father sat at the head of the long table, but the confidence he usually carried was gone. His face was pale, and the tension in his shoulders was obvious. Two directors leaned toward each other, whispering nervously. A man from the legal department stared down at his notes as if they might suddenly disappear. Another executive looked so uncomfortable that it seemed as though he had swallowed something he shouldn't have. I walked calmly to the empty seat at the far end of the table and sat down. No one spoke. They were waiting for me, but I didn't say a word. Instead, I opened the leather folder I had brought with me and carefully placed a single document in front of me on the table. The original founder agreement. It was old, but the signatures were still clear. My name sat beside the names of the first investors who believed in the company when it was nothing more than an idea written on a whiteboard. That document didn't just confirm my 49% ownership. It also contained something even more important, the veto rights clause. A clause her father had clearly forgotten about. The meeting began with forced professionalism. Reports were read. Numbers were discussed. Charts appeared on screens. Everyone tried to pretend that the man they once dismissed was now just another quiet attendee. I listened without interrupting. Then the conversation moved to the major acquisition her father had been proudly promising to investors for weeks. The vote was about to begin. Directors began raising their hands. That's when I calmly lifted mine. Vetoed. The word cut through the room. Everything stopped. Pens froze in midair. Chairs creaked as people turned toward me. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "Shall we talk now?" I asked. Her father's voice came out tight and controlled. "Ethan, this acquisition is strategic. We've already announced it." "You announced it," I corrected quietly. "Without consulting a co-founder, without a board vote, and definitely without checking clause 17.3. The legal advisor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew I was right. One of the directors leaned forward, concern written across his face. "If this gets blocked now," he said carefully, "we could be in violation of investor disclosure laws." I didn't smile. I wasn't there to embarrass anyone, and I certainly wasn't there for revenge. I was there to remind them of something they had forgotten. The quiet man they once tried to buy off was the same man who had built the system their entire company depended on. When the company was still fragile, when the servers crashed weekly and security threats came from every direction, I had been the one working through the night to build the infrastructure that protected everything. Back then, half the board didn't even understand basic security systems. "I'm not trying to sink the ship," I said calmly. "I'm trying to steer it." Her father clenched his fists on the table. "You're making this personal." "No," I replied, meeting his eyes. "You made it personal the moment you slid that envelope across the table and tried to trade your daughter's life for your illusion of control." The room went completely silent again. Then one of the younger board members spoke up. He had been quiet the entire meeting, but now his voice carried a firm clarity. "Maybe it's time we stop treating Mr. Shaw like a threat," he said, "and start recognizing him as a partner." I slowly stood from my chair. "Good," I said calmly, "because starting tomorrow, I won't be your silent partner anymore." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle across the room. "I'm stepping into the light." The press release went live Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Within minutes, phones across the city buzzed with the news. Ethan Shaw named co-CEO of Linhart Global after strategic board restructuring. Messages began pouring in almost immediately. Former colleagues who had once underestimated me. Old college friends who hadn't heard from me in years. Even two of Lena's cousins who used to joke that I had married above my place. The story sounded very different now. I wasn't just Lena's husband anymore. I was the man helping lead the company they all thought I had no place in. That morning, I walked into headquarters without even showing a badge. The receptionist stood up the moment she saw me heading toward the executive elevators. Word had clearly traveled fast. Inside the elevator, I found her father standing alone. For 5 floors, neither of us said anything. Then he finally spoke. "You think you've won?" I stared straight ahead. This was never a game. He scoffed quietly. "You humiliated me." I turned toward him calmly. "No," I said. "You humiliated yourself the moment you confused quiet for weakness." The elevator doors opened. I stepped out first. That day, I made 2 decisions. The first was to rehire the junior developer team he had laid off the previous quarter simply to make the company's budget look better on paper. Those young developers had talent. They had passion. They deserved better than being sacrificed for appearances. The second decision was harder. I reassigned him. He would remain with the company, still paid, still holding a title, but it would be a non-voting advisory role. He could attend meetings. He could offer opinions, but he would no longer sit in the room where real decisions were made. He didn't argue. He didn't protest, because deep down, he knew the truth. The man he once dismissed across a dinner table was now the one signing the approvals that determined his position. That evening, Lena asked me to meet her on the rooftop of the building. It was the same rooftop where we had once stood years ago, talking about our dreams while eating cheap takeout and laughing about how expensive the city felt. Back then, our biggest worry had been rent. She leaned against the railing, looking out across the glowing skyline. "You really never planned to tell me?" she asked softly. I walked over and stood beside her. "Not until I knew for sure that you loved me for the man I was," I said quietly, not the name behind it. She nodded slowly. "And now?" she asked. I looked out over the city lights. "Now the name belongs to both of us," I said. "But the reason it means anything is still you." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the envelope from that dinner. It was slightly creased now, still sealed. "I never opened it," she said. "Didn't need to." I took the envelope from her hands and looked at it for a moment. The same offer that had been meant to erase me from their lives. Then I tore it in half. Not out of anger. Not for drama. Simply because it had never mattered. "I'm sorry they saw you that way," Lena whispered. I turned toward her. They only saw what I allowed them to see. She smiled softly. Still the quiet one. I shook my head. "Not anymore." Behind us, the lights of our company glowed across the towering glass building, reflecting against the night sky. For years, my work had remained hidden in the background. But now, the silence that once protected me had finally been broken, and the world was beginning to hear my voice.